Hey everyone, it's Jacob. If you haven't grabbed a copy of my brand new book, The Future Leader, yet, then I would love it and appreciate it if you do so. I honestly believe that this is going to be an extremely valuable resource for you as you go along your leadership journey. I had the opportunity to interview over 140 of the world's top CEOs from organizations like Oracle, Unilever, Best Buy, MasterCard, KPMG, Verizon, and over 130 others. I've actually gotten lots of emails and comments from people saying that they believe that this book is the blueprint for current and aspiring leaders to lead in a post-COVID world. You can grab a copy at getfutureleaderbook.com. Again, that is getfutureleaderbook.com. I'm sharing this again now because I think as a result of the events of 2020, what's been going on over the last 12 to 16 months, leadership has changed forever. But why has it changed? How has it changed? And what does that mean for you, your teams, and your organization? That's exactly what I explore in this book. Paul Pullman, the CEO of Unilever, actually said about my book, based on impressive research, this is the guidebook for the next generation of leaders around the world. So I hope that inspires you and motivates you to grab a copy for yourself and your teams. Again, you can do so at getfutureleaderbook.com, and you can learn why organizations around the world are using this for training their current and their aspiring leaders. Today, I am sharing a talk I gave for an organization actually just before COVID in front of around 1,000 people, and I believe this event was in Dallas. And this event was very interesting because it's actually the first time that I gave a talk on my book, The Future Leader. In fact, when I gave this talk, my book wasn't even out yet. So it was very, very exciting for me, very interesting, also very nerve-wracking, but it ended up being one of my most favorite talks that I've given, just in general, and especially on my new book, The Future Leader, even though it was the first time I've ever given it. So I have no idea why that happened, but it did. And this, of course, was in person back in the good old days when I was actually giving in-person talks. Nowadays, everything's virtual, sitting in my sweatpants, hanging out at home. But thankfully, things are returning back to some sense of normalcy. I already have a couple in-person speeches booked, and I'm really, really excited to get back on the road to see all of your wonderful faces, shake your hands, give hugs, and get a chance to see all of you in person instead of just behind a camera. So very, very much looking forward to that. And I remember when I gave this talk, I was, of course, super nervous because nobody had ever heard the themes, the concepts, or the words that I was going to utter on this stage prior to my actually doing it. So the company that actually brought me in took a little bit of a chance on me, but it ended up being a lot of fun. Everybody loved it. And of course, I had a blast as well. So I hope you enjoy this talk on my book, The Future Leader. I'm releasing it now because especially as things start to open back up, I think we really need to revisit this concept of leadership and what it means to be a future-ready leader and what we need to do to lead in a post-COVID world. So without further ado, let's jump right into this podcast. Hope you enjoy. If we were to look back throughout history, when mariners and explorers would go off into uncharted waters, the way that they would oftentimes find their way back home would be through some sort of a landmark. Now, during the day, this landmark would be something like a pile of rocks. But at night, the landmark would have to be something else. In this case, a burning flame, right? Large fire. And over the centuries, this concept has evolved until ultimately we created lighthouses. These big, tall structures where we would put these burning fires and eventually these lights. And the entire purpose of a lighthouse is always to guide people to safety, to help them find their way back home, and to help make sure that they stay away from rocks or cliffs that might crush their ships. And when I was thinking about this concept of the future leader, I very much thought of this idea of a lighthouse, because I think leaders now, and especially in the future, have to be lighthouses. I mean, all of you in this room, your job is to guide people and organizations to success, to help make sure that they stay away from the rocks, to help make sure that they don't crash into the cliffs, and to help make sure that they and the organization as a whole can succeed. But in order to do that, you also have to build yourselves up. Right? You have to become that lighthouse. You have to learn new things. You have to evolve and adapt so that you can in turn shine your light onto others and onto this sea of uncertainty that we are all a part of. And we all know the impact of working for both a bad leader and a great leader. And when you work for a bad leader, you don't feel engaged, empowered, inspired, motivated. When your alarm clock goes off in the morning, you dread waking up and having to show up to work. You don't want to be a part of the organization. You're basically a cog. And unfortunately, a lot of people around the world work for those types of leaders. In fact, there was a study that was actually done on 400,000 Americans. And it actually found that working for a bad leader can quite literally kill you. Because it's one of the leading causes of stress, which translates into cardiovascular disease and heart disease. So not only is it bad for the organization, it's quite literally bad for the very people who work for that kind of a leader. Now, on the other side, we all know what it's like to work for a great leader as well, where when you show up to work, you feel engaged and empowered and motivated, where you feel like somebody is there that has your back. And never before have we needed these types of leaders, these types of great leaders. And it's because leaders quite literally shape the world. I mean, think about the role that leaders play in society. They invest in nonprofits and charitable organizations. They fight for social causes. They build the products and services that so many of us use in our lives and inside of our organizations. They create organizations that offer jobs for millions and billions of people around the world. They create cultures that shape not only how employees behave at work, but also outside of work, what they value, what they care about, what they believe. So leaders have a tremendous impact, not just on organizations, but also on society as a whole. And this is why I think this visual of a lighthouse is so relevant for the leader of today and of the future. But I think we can all agree that things change quickly. Things change all the time, all right? The pace of change is one of the things that we keep hearing about. So I think it's important for us to look towards the future and to try to understand, what will leadership look like in the future? What will it take to be a leader in the future? And so this was kind of the basic question that I started off with when I was doing my research. And it forced me to ask kind of two questions. The first is, will the leader of 2030 be that different than today? And if so, how? So, quick show of hands, those of you in the room, how many of you think that the leader of 2030 will be more or less identical or similar to the leader of today? Nobody? A couple of people? Okay, I appreciate your bravery. How many of you think the leader of 2030 is going to be just a totally different animal? Okay? And how many of you are kind of like in between? Okay, a lot of people are in between. So to try to understand this, I embarked on an extensive research project over the past year. Now, to give you a little bit of context why this is so crucial, I estimate that by 2030, we're going to have between 88 million and 440 million leaders around the world. That is, people who are responsible for others. Now, of course, the numbers are quite diverse because one is very conservative, one is a little bit less conservative, but if you kind of want to go somewhere in the middle, we're looking at around 200 million leaders around the world by the year 2030. That is a lot of people. If we're going to have hundreds of millions of people in leadership roles where their job is to shape society, to shape the world, to shape cultures and values, then we better make sure that we have the right people in place. So how do we figure out what the leader of the future is going to look like? So I interviewed 140 CEOs at companies around the world. In fact, I'm still doing one or two of these interviews because the manuscript for this book isn't even due for another week. So I interviewed the CEOs of companies like Unilever, MasterCard, Best Buy, Oracle, Yahoo, Kaiser, all over the world, over 20 countries, representing over 35 industries, and these CEOs are collectively responsible for the lives of over 7 million people. In addition to that, I also partnered with LinkedIn, the world's largest professional social network. I'm sure many of you are on LinkedIn. And we surveyed almost 14,000 employees around the world who identified as being employed full-time. And the idea here was to try to match what CEOs are telling me versus what employees who work for these CEOs are actually experiencing. And what I wanted to understand is, what will it take to be a leader in the future? What are the common themes that keep coming up from all of these discussions with 140 CEOs? Now, the first question that I asked all of these CEOs is a very basic one. What is leadership? Who is a leader? And the responses that I got back to this question just totally blew my mind. I got responses like, that's a good question. Or, oh man, that's a tough one. Or, nobody's ever asked me that before. And you can imagine I'm interviewing these CEOs, and I'm thinking, okay, let me understand this. You are the CEO of a multi-billion-dollar company. You are responsible for the lives of thousands of employees, and this is a hard question? Doesn't make any sense. And so this totally blew me away, but then I started to think about it a little bit, and I realized that we take these concepts for granted. Leadership and being a leader, most people take it for granted. It's sort of like water. I mean, if you had to define water to somebody, would you be able to? I mean, what would you say? It's a clear, tasteless liquid? Thousands of liquids fit into that category. But everybody knows what water is because we're surrounded by it. It's everywhere. And so we assume that everybody knows what water is. And leadership is very much the same. We experience leadership and we see leaders every day in multiple forms. Inside of your company, when you go to the supermarket to buy something and you see a supervisor and how they interact with the rest of their employees. When you go shopping for anything. When you watch TV, when you listen to the news, when you listen to the radio, when you play sports. It's everywhere. And because it's everywhere, we sort of assume that everybody knows what it is. And everybody knows what a good leader is and who a leader is and what makes a great leader because it's everywhere. But what I learned from asking these CEOs these questions is that leaders don't spend enough time asking this very, very basic thing. So ask yourselves that mentally. What is leadership? How would you define leadership if I had to ask you to define it? 140 CEOs I interviewed, I got 140 responses on how they define leadership. No 140 responses were the same. How could that be the case? 140 of the world's top CEOs all define leadership differently. And the way that they define leadership then dictates the type of organization that they create. Some leaders that I interviewed said, leadership is about results. It's about putting the right people in the right chairs and achieving the mission of the organization. Nothing else matters. And then you look at the type of culture that CEO creates, and it reflects on the definition that he gave me. And then another CEO would say something like, it's about purpose and meaning and impact and doing the right thing and making the world a better place. And you see that CEO created a different culture. So the definitions and how you think about these things matter a great deal. And the fact that CEOs and business leaders around the world don't spend enough time thinking about it also means that the organizations as a whole don't spend enough time thinking about this. And that is a challenge. So getting back to the two original questions that I asked, will leadership be that different in the future, in 10 years, and if so, how? The general consensus from all the CEOs that I interviewed is, while there are a core set of attributes that will remain relevant for leaders, things like being able to create a vision, things like being able to execute on strategy, those things will remain relevant, and they've always been relevant. But what is also true is that when we think about the future of leadership, leaders are going to require a new set of skills and mindsets in order to lead. Why is that the case? Because the organizations themselves are going to look fundamentally different. Technology, artificial intelligence making its way into organizations, purpose, meaning, and impact, globalization, the changing nature of talent and what talent even looks like, and what they care about and what they value. The lifespan of organizations is shrinking. This means we're going to have new business models, new ways of working, new ways of thinking about work. So if the companies themselves are going to look different, it only stands to reason that we're going to need a new type of leader or a different type of leader to lead those types of organizations. What does that new leader look like? So from all these interviews that I did, I wanted to identify what are the most common mindsets, the most common skills that 140 of the world's top business leaders keep identifying. And these are them. 4 mindsets, 5 skills. If you can master these 4 mindsets and these 5 skills, and by the way, also help those around you master these 4 mindsets and 5 skills, you will be not only a great leader now, but you will be a great future leader. And when I say successful and great, I don't just mean a leader who makes the business more money, because that's not how I define greatness or success for leadership. Of course, being able to make the organization successful is a part of that. But it's also about creating an environment where employees actually want to show up. It's making a difference. It's focusing on that purpose, that meaning, that impact. It's the human stuff that will also matter a great deal, and that's part of what will make you a great leader, not just bringing in more money to the business. So let's start off with the first one, the global citizen. Ilham Kadri is the CEO of Solvay, 25,000 person chemical company. And she grew up in Morocco. She was raised by her illiterate grandmother. And as a child growing up, her grandmother told Ilham that girls typically have 2 exits in life. The first exit that a girl has is from their parents' home to their husbands. And the second exit that a girl in Morocco has is to the grave. And Ilham thought about that for a while, and she decided to create a third exit for herself, which she did in the form of education. And she studied math, she studied physics, she went on to go get her master's degree. Ultimately, then she went on to go get her PhD. And through the pursuit of education, she had the unique opportunity to work for many organizations and diverse projects all over the world, in places like the Middle East, Africa, China, the United States, Europe, and she had the opportunity to actually live and work in these places. She learned, for example, the importance of patience in Japan. She learned the importance that in Saudi Arabia, a verbal agreement is just as good as a written one. She learned the importance of entrepreneurship in the United States, that anything is possible in China, that focusing on your life and your family is just as important as work in Europe. She learned the importance of going slow to go fast in Africa. And she told me this really interesting story about how she had to negotiate a deal between Saudi Arabia and the United States, 2 very, very different parts of the world. And the deal was for a water plant. And she had to bring together these 2 different cultures, perspectives, these 2 different worlds, and get them to see eye to eye. That's what being a global citizen is all about. It is embracing this diversity. It is about surrounding yourself with people who don't think like you, who don't look like you, who don't act like you. This is essential when we think about leadership in any capacity. And having this global mindset of surrounding yourself with these types of people also means that you need to think big picture. You need to understand how things that you do in one part of the world, if you would be able to do those same things in another part of the world. For example, ask yourself right now, if you were taken out of your current environment and put into another part of the world, would you be able to lead effectively? If you had to go to a different country, a different city, maybe even a different team, would you lead effectively? Or would you only be comfortable being surrounded by those who are like you. And in this globally connected and distributed world, having this global citizen mindset is going to be essential. And when you don't have it, bad things can happen. Disney tried to open a theme park in Paris a couple of years ago. And they thought that they could just copy and paste whatever worked in the United States, drop it into Paris, and it would be great. And it failed miserably. So they named the park Euro Disney. Now, as anyone knows, the currency that they use in Europe is the euro. They literally named the theme park Dollar Disney. Not only that, but they failed to take into account European culture and values. So Parisians especially, they pride themselves on their culinary prowess. So you can imagine their shock when they would have lunch inside of Euro Disney, only to find that they would have to eat with plastic cutlery. They were appalled. It's also very customary in Paris to have wine or some alcoholic beverage with your lunch. And so you can imagine that they weren't too pleased when they wanted to order wine with their lunch in Euro Disney, only to be told that there's no alcohol allowed. And it was a lot of missteps like that that caused employees to go on strike. The whole operation almost went bankrupt before they were finally able to turn it around. Have that global mindset. Surround yourself with people who are not like you. And when I say surround yourself, I don't just mean be okay with it. I mean actively pursue it. Actively ask to be a part of and to create teams of people who are not like you. Glenn Fogel was one of the CEOs that I interviewed. He's the CEO of Bookings Holdings. They own Kayak, they own Priceline, those types of sites I'm sure a lot of you use. And I love the quote that he gave me. You can't be a leader of a world-size organization without a world-size mindset. Next, we have the mindset of the servant. What I always find fascinating about the mindset of the servant is that throughout history, we've always looked down on servants. They were less educated, less successful, they had less money, they were second-class citizens. Yet today, what is the one thing that we keep hearing about that leaders need to have? Servant leadership. Now, that's a part of what having the mindset of the servant means, but what a lot of these other, the 140 CEOs told me is that that's only a part of the picture. The servant mindset means that not only do you have humility and vulnerability, not only do you not take yourself too seriously and view yourself better than everybody else, but you also service your leaders if you have them, your customers, your team, and yourself. A lot of people forget that leaders need to serve themselves. Whenever you're flying in an airplane, they always say, put your own oxygen mask on first before you help others. Serving yourself means that as a leader, you take care of yourself emotionally, physically, mentally, spiritually, whatever you need to do. And it's understanding that you cannot shine your light onto other people unless you take care of yourself. This is why organizations around the world are investing in a lot of these health and well-being programs. You have to take care of yourself because if you don't, you won't be able to take care of your team. Now, I think for this audience, probably the most applicable servant mindset story would be around serving your team. And my favorite example of this comes from David Novak. And he is the former CEO of Yum Brands. And when he was the CEO of Yum Brands, he was responsible for the lives of 1.5 million people, including the franchisees. It's a massive workforce, one of the largest on planet Earth. But before David was at Yum Brands, he was an executive at Pepsi-Cola. And he was in a new role in operations. And he wanted to learn as much as he could while he was in this new role. So he got together a team of 12 merchandisers, and he held a meeting with all of them in St. Louis. And they all gathered around a table. He sat them all down, and he said, okay, who in this room, from all of you 12 merchandisers, who's the best merchandiser? Who do you guys all turn to for help and guidance? And one by one, everybody in the room would say, oh, you got to talk to Bob. Bob is the best merchandiser that's here. Customers love Bob. I've learned more from Bob in 3 days than I have learned from 3 years being at this company. So David's like, all right, I got to talk to Bob. And David looks down the table, and he sees Bob sitting there weeping. And I still get goosebumps when I tell this story. When David told me this story over the phone, I was like, oh man, I was just sat there in like silence. And so he sees Bob weeping, and he goes over to Bob and he says, Bob, what's going on? Everyone is saying these amazing things about you. And Bob says, I've been at this company for 47 years. I'm retiring in 2 weeks, and I never knew that anybody felt this way about me. And that was one of the most impactful moments in David's leadership career. And after that moment, he realized that one of the ways that he wants to serve his teams is by recognizing them. It's a simple thing for leaders to do. You recognize your people. So he embarked on this recognition crusade during his career. And when he was the president of KFC, he would recognize his employees by giving them a rubber chicken. KFC rubber chicken. And he would number the rubber chicken. He would write what the employee did to deserve that rubber chicken. And he would take a picture with the employee and the rubber chicken and send it to them framed. And he would also give them $100 as well, because as he told me on the phone, you can't eat a floppy chicken. And when he became the president of Pizza Hut, he took the big cheese hats, the Green Bay Packer cheese hats, numbered it, wrote what the employee did to deserve it, picture with the employee, send it to them, $100. When he became the CEO of Yum Brands, he did it with wind-up teeth that you can see sitting there. Numbered it, wrote on it, picture, sent it to the employee. And this created an amazing culture of recognition in his company. Now, the best part about this is that David didn't mandate anybody to do this. He didn't tell his leaders, have a recognition award. He didn't say, this is what I'm doing, you have to follow in my footsteps. But because people saw David doing it and because they saw the impact that it had, they started to do it as well. And the president of Taco Bell would do it on a hot sauce packet. Other leaders would give boxing gloves for a knockout performance. And your recognition award became kind of like your calling card, your symbol inside of Yum Brands. And it all started with a guy named Bob. So ask yourself what you can do on a regular basis to service your team, even if it's something as small as giving them a rubber chicken. Here's a quote from Carrie, who runs the Bay Federal Credit Union. They have around 220 people. And she believes in serving her team by being present on day one, on hour one. When employees first start working there, she meets all of them and basically says, I am here to serve you. Simple act. Next, we have the mindset of the chef. There's one person who's largely credited with bringing French cuisine to the United States and making it popular, and that person is Julia Child. And she grew up in the early 1900s, actually not too far away from where I grew up in California. I grew up in Granada Hills. She grew up in Pasadena. And after she graduated college, she wanted to join the army. But she was told that she was too tall. She was 6'2". And so because she was told she was too tall to join the army, she instead joined the Office of Strategic Services. And the Office of Strategic Services proved to be a great career choice for her. She saw the world. She traveled to a lot of different places. And on one of her assignments, she got her first exposure to the culinary world. And she was tasked with trying to develop some sort of a concoction that would deter sharks from detonating underwater explosives that were designed to blow up German U-boats. So the idea was the sharks kept crashing into these underwater mines, blowing them up, and then the German U-boats would just sail right through. So is there something that she could do so that the sharks would not go near these underwater explosives? And she devised some sort of mixture that they were able to sprinkle and put around these underwater explosives, and the sharks weren't detonating them anymore. After she finished the Office of Strategic Services, she ended up in Paris. She studied at Cordon Bleu. She wrote numerous books. She had a TV show that we're all familiar with. And the rest, as they say, is history. But what I love about Julia Child is that she was a master of balance. Not only a balance of making tasty food, but she was really big on healthy food. And balance means that as a chef, if you ask any chef, they'll always tell you, you put too much of one ingredient, it's too salty. You put too much of another ingredient, it's too sweet, or it becomes unhealthy. And chefs have lots of different ingredients that they need to balance all the time. As leaders, you have two ingredients that you have to balance. Just two. Humanity, technology. The human side of work with the technology side of work. And you need both. You need the technology side of work because technology is what gives you speed. It's what makes you agile and nimble. It's what allows you to make quick decisions. It's what allows you to create these products and services. But you also need the human side too, don't you? Because that's how business operates. Your customers, your clients, your patients, all of these people are humans. All of you are humans. So if you have too much of the technology component, what you're going to find is that your employees are going to pull back. Your customers are going to be maybe a little bit wary of transacting, interacting with you. But if you have only the human component, you're going to find that you're moving really slow. Your competitors are able to overtake you constantly. You're not able to move quickly. You're not productive or efficient. So you need to balance the two of humanity and technology. Those are the two ingredients that you need to think about. Now, by all means, embrace technology. Use as much technology as you possibly can, but think about technology in the context of how can it make your organization more human? How can it add value to your people? How can it improve experiences? How can it augment your people? Not how can it replace them? Don't just make it a conversation about how do I cut costs? How do I make money? If that is the conversation that you are going to focus with technology, you are going to build a purely technology-driven company. And that will not do well. You need to have the balance of both of these coming together. So like I said, use technology, but just frame the conversation around technology differently. And one of my favorite stories around this comes from Accenture. They recently automated 17,000 jobs. All the jobs that they automated were in finance. These were number crunchers, people who literally were calculating numbers and then presenting those numbers to clients. They automated all those jobs, but they didn't lose a single worker because they upskilled and retrained all of those workers to become strategic advisors instead, to focus on the human component, adding more value to their customers and also teaching their employees new skills. They didn't think about it in terms of how do we cut people, how do we remove people. So you have to have that mindset of the chef. You have to balance those two things together. Nancy Brown is the CEO of the American Heart Association. And when I interviewed her, she gave me this wonderful, wonderful quote. And she understood this concept of that business is still fundamentally about people. It is still fundamentally about people. That's what requires business to work. That's what requires the world to still move. It is about people. We cannot forget that. The next mindset is the mindset of the explorer. Sir Ernest Henry Shackleton is someone who most people have never heard of, yet he was behind and is responsible for perhaps one of the greatest leadership stories ever told. And when he was young, he was a voracious reader. But he always wanted to explore, to see new things, to experience new things, and he didn't have a lot of money, neither did his family. So he became an apprentice on a sailing vessel that allowed him to travel the world, and through the apprenticeship, he slowly moved up the ranks until he finally was able to captain his own ship. And in 1914, he set off on an expedition to explore the Antarctic. Now, to find a crew, he took an ad out in the newspaper. Men wanted for hazardous journey, small wages, bitter cold, long months of complete darkness, constant danger, safe return doubtful, honor and recognition in case of success. Now, this to me reads a lot like a modern day job description, but a lot of employees don't even get the recognition during success. Now, sure enough, a couple dozen men applied, and their trip began. And it didn't take long before disaster struck. While they were in the Weddell Sea in the Antarctic, their ship, the Endurance, this is an actual picture of the ship, became entombed in ice. For 10 months, they were trapped in ice on this ship. Until finally, the pressure of the ice became too much. It crushed the ship, and it sank. But not before the members of the crew couldn't get off with their lifeboats and all their supplies. And they made an ice floe their home. And an ice floe is basically a large floating piece of ice. It can be as big as a couple miles. And they lived on that ice floe for another 5 months. We're talking about 15 months now without stepping foot on solid ground. The ice floe that they were on started to melt and crack and dissolve beneath their very feet. So Shackleton made the decision that they were going to sail for Elephant Island. Elephant Island was a 5-day sail battling high winds, high seas, but finally they made it to Elephant Island. Upon reaching Elephant Island, they realized that the island is uninhabited and also uninhabitable. So again, Shackleton had to make a decision. What do we do? His goal shifted from exploring the Antarctic to the survival of his people. And so he decided to take a smaller crew and to sail to South Georgia Island. Over 2 weeks sailing. It was terrible weather. They had trouble navigating because they couldn't see the sun, the stars, the sky. Finally, they arrive at South Georgia Island because there was a whaling station there. They get to South Georgia Island only to realize that the whaling station is on the other side of the island. So again, Shackleton takes 1 or 2 members of his crew, leaves the other 2 behind, and for several days, they hike through the snow, through the ice, through terrible weather, until finally they reach the whaling station. It took 3 attempts and 3 more additional months before they were able to rescue the people who were still stuck on Elephant Island. Now, there are a couple of really cool parts to this story. The first part is that every member of the crew survived. Every single member of the crew survived. And this has become a very great case study in leadership of how Shackleton was able to keep his crew alive. So for starters, he constantly maintained his optimism. He encouraged them to toast their loved ones and to host sing-alongs. He was the type of leader where somebody quoted, he would be willing to give the shirt off of his back for his crew. He was very agile and nimble in his way of thinking. When they were hiking across South Georgia Island, he figured that they would take the screws from one of the least damaged lifeboats, put the screws in the bottom of their shoes to get traction, and use that to hike. He had a growth mindset. He didn't view these obstacles or these failures as permanent situations. He viewed them as things that needed to be overcome. That is ultimately what makes a great explorer. Based on interviews with over 140 of the world's top CEOs from organizations like Oracle, Unilever, MasterCard, KPMG, Verizon, Audi, and over 130 others, The Future Leader is the only book out there that's going to teach you the 4 mindsets and the 5 skills that you need to master to lead in the new world of work that we are all a part of, because let's face it, leadership is changing. Hubert Joly, the CEO of Best Buy, said that this book is a tour de force and that this may be the most thoroughly researched and comprehensive thought piece on leadership that is out there today. So I hope you decide to grab a copy. You can do so at getfutureleaderbook.com. You can also go there to learn more about the book and get links for yourself and your team to grab a copy. You will likely have to reinvent yourself several times during your career if you haven't already. Your organization may need to reinvent itself as well. You have to have the mindset of the explorer, agile and nimble in your thinking, having that growth mindset, being curious, being okay with the uncomfortable, with seeking out new things. That is essential for having this kind of an explorer mindset, because you haven't seen it all. And as the CEO of SOS International has told me, and he's probably the CEO that I interviewed who's been in the leadership position the longest, over 40 years. You would think that this guy has seen it all, has done it all, knows it all. And even he says, with the changes that are happening, nobody has seen it all. So these are the 4 mindsets that you have to possess: the global citizen, the servant, the chef, and the explorer. Let's talk about the skills. The skills are things that you actually need to know how to do. The first one is the skill of the coach. If you've ever watched a basketball game, a hockey game, a tennis match, whatever it might be, whenever they interview the winning team or the winning player, they always say, "I couldn't have done it without my coach." That is because the coach helps you become a better version of yourself. A coach helps you do things that you didn't even know you could do. That is what a great coach does. It's the human stuff. Now, when we think about technology, right, think about, for example, the stereotypical role that most leaders have. It could usually be broken up into 2 buckets. Leaders have to make decisions, right? They have information, they have all the connections, they make the decisions because they know everything, they sit higher up at the food chain. That's one job of the leader. The second job of the leader is to get people to move in the direction of that decision. What we already see now is that technology and AI is augmenting a lot of the decision-making stuff. You can imagine where it's going to be in 10 years. If you are a bad leader and all you do is focus on telling other people what to do, the command and control, I made the decision, you follow my decision, if technology will augment much of that, what value do you have to the organization? None. But if you are a good leader and you also focus on this human side, now all of a sudden your value in the company goes up tenfold. So the coach is a lot of this human stuff that matters. And a lot of people believe that one of the greatest coaches ever of any sport was John Wooden, aka the Wizard of Westwood. And he was the coach of UCLA men's basketball team during the 1900s. Mid-1950s. And he led UCLA to 10 college championships, including an unheard of 7 in a row. And John did a couple of things which I thought were fascinating. The first thing that John did is that he believed that in order to be a great ball player, you have to be a great human being. And so what that means is that he understood the players on his team not just as ball players, but as human beings. As leaders, you need to understand your employees, not just as employees, but as human beings. What they care about, what they value, what matters to them. You can't just look at them as players on the court. The other thing that John did is that he focused on the strengths of his players. He knew, for example, that you can't have a team where everyone is an all-star. You might have members of your team who are good at specific things. So, for example, in John's case, there would be players that can only make a basket from one part of the court. But if you put them in that one part of the court, they'll nail that shot almost every time. So when he would design plays, he would design a play so that during the game, that player would end up in that particular spot on the court with the ball so that they could make the basket. He focused on their strengths. Being a coach means, probably above all, that you help make other people more successful, even if it means more successful than you. Now, how many of you have kids? Okay, a lot of people. Now, how many of you, when your child does something that you couldn't do, or when they do something better than you, how many of you look at your kid and say, "What the hell? I couldn't do that. What are you doing better than me in that?" Right? You flick them over. Right? You don't. When your child does something better than you, you look at them with a sense of a pride and accomplishment and, wow, I helped raise you and now you're doing something better than me. That is the role of a coach. When somebody becomes more successful, even more successful than you, you look at them with a sense of pride. Coaching means you help make other people more successful, right? That's what it ultimately comes down to. Michel Combs is the CEO of Sprint. When we talked, he gave me this quote where he specifically said that he views his role as a coach to help push people to their maximum, unlock their potential, help them do things they didn't even know that they could do. That is what a coach does. That's what's required. That's what we need inside of our organizations. We need these types of coaches. Next is the skill of the futurist. Interestingly enough, this was the number one skill that the 140 CEOs told me they believe is the most important. There were a couple others that were tied for second and third, but this one came out on top. Now, Isaac Asimov is my favorite science fiction writer, and he wrote a series of books called the Foundation series. And in the Foundation series, there's a character known as Harry Seldon. And Harry Seldon develops something known as psychohistory. And psychohistory is this theory of being able to predict the future on a grand scale. Not like for an individual like you and me, but for the galactic empire, right? So big picture scale prediction. Now, when most people think of a futurist, that's what they think of. They think of somebody who predicts the future. But that's not what we do. Futurists don't predict the future. They just help make sure that people and organizations are not surprised by what the future might bring. Now, a lot of business leaders keep saying, we want somebody who can see around corners. As we all know, nobody can see around a corner. So what do? If you can't see around a corner, what do? I play a lot of chess. It's become a big passion of mine lately. And if anybody's played chess, or if you've heard of chess, you know that there are a lot of moves that you can make. There are more possible moves that you can make in a game of chess than there are atoms in the entire universe on an 8x8 square, right? So it's a virtually limitless game. But when top grandmasters play the game of chess, they don't know what move their opponent is going to make, but the way that they think is different. A novice chess player will just say something like, I'm going to move a pawn. I'm going to move my knight. I'm going to move my rook. A grandmaster says, I'll move my pawn. If my opponent moves their knight, then I'll move my bishop. And if I move my bishop, my opponent might move either their knight or their pawn, or maybe they'll move their queen. And if they do any one of those things, here are some options that I have. In other words, they think in terms of scenarios. They think in terms of possibilities. And this is a very, very critical skill to have because a lot of leaders are very stuck, oftentimes, in very linear thinking. They have trouble changing course. They have trouble getting rid of outdated practices. They have trouble challenging the status quo. They find one path, they stick to it. That's a recipe for failure. You have to be able to think like a futurist in terms of possibilities and scenarios. Different ways, right? So basically what happens is you see around multiple corners at the same time instead of just one. Now, the other big challenge for a lot of leaders I see is they keep asking this question of what is the future of work? But that is the wrong question to ask because it assumes that there's only one future, which there's not. There are a lot of different things that could happen. But when leaders ask that question, it makes them passive. What is the future of work? In other words, what's going to happen and what do I got to do? Right? It's like somebody's going to punch you in the stomach and all you can do is just kind of like tighten up. Instead, the right way to think about it is what is the future of work you want to see happen and how are you going to build it? Much more active, right? You design, you create, you shape, you build the future. There are a lot of tools that futurists use. In fact, there's a master's degree that you can get on foresight. But one of the most useful tools that futurists use is something known as the cone of possibilities. And the cone of possibilities essentially asks 4 questions. And if you can learn to ask these 4 questions regularly, whether you need to make a decision, whether you're focusing on a strategy, just learn to kind of play around with these 4 questions in your mind, and you'll see that the way that you think starts to change. So the first question is, why might something happen? And you can kind of play around with this right now. One of the common areas that this is oftentimes applied to is jobs and automation. So a lot of people say lots of jobs will be automated. Some people say jobs won't be automated. So how would you think through something like that? Well, why might that happen? Why might there be a massive jobs exodus? Why might millions or billions of people around the world become unemployed as a result of technology? What else might happen? So if that doesn't happen, what's another scenario that might come up? Well, maybe everything stays the same. I don't know. What do you want to happen? If you could control and shape anything and have the desired outcome, what would you make it be? And the last question is, what might impact why or why not something would happen? So what might impact why a jobs exodus would happen? Why a jobs apocalypse would happen? What are the factors that would impact and influence that? If you can start to learn to think with these questions and start to play around with these different scenarios in your mind, you're going to change the way that you think, and you're no longer going to have a linear path that you follow. You're going to start to branch off into all sorts of little paths, and that will very much help you in the decision-making process. Tom Wilson is the CEO of Allstate, and he summed this up very nicely. Leadership is about shaping the future, not just reacting to trends. All of you in this room have tremendous responsibility to build and shape the future of your company. Not to just worry about what's going to impact you and what's going to happen to you in the future, but to actually build and shape what that future looks like. Next, we have the skill of Yoda. Does anybody not know who Yoda is, just out of curiosity, so that we can all make fun of you? So Yoda first made his appearance in the 1980s in Star Wars. Of course, he was the guide, the mentor, the teacher of all the other Jedi. He's also who many people consider to be the most emotionally intelligent character who's ever been created. I mean, I suppose he should be, after all. He's 900 years old. Yoda is about the skill of emotional intelligence. Now, the business leaders I interviewed specifically identified two aspects of emotional intelligence: empathy and self-awareness. Empathy is about being able to put yourself into somebody else's shoes, to see things the way they see things. This is in stark contrast to what we have in a lot of organizations, which is sympathy. Sympathy means that you say you're sorry, and we get told I'm sorry all the time. You call a 1-800 number, the first thing that somebody says on the phone is, I'm sorry you're going through that. You check in late for a flight, you miss a plane, I'm sorry. We get told I'm sorry all the time. We also get told I'm sorry all the time by coworkers, by peers, by leaders. It is not about being sorry. It is about literally thinking about a time when you felt the way, or when you were in a similar situation that other person was in, and thinking about how you felt. Putting yourself into somebody else's shoes. Seeing things the way they see things. This is crucial because this is where psychological safety and trust and all that humanness comes from. It's when people believe and understand that they can connect with you. They don't connect with you when you say, I'm sorry. They connect with you when you say, you know what? I was in a similar situation like that. I know exactly how you feel. That's the connection. Big difference. Empathy is about understanding how somebody else feels. Then we have self-awareness. I interviewed Dr. Tasha Eurich, who's probably the world's leading expert on self-awareness. And she wrote a fantastic book on this, and she identifies two components of self-awareness: the internal side and the external side. The internal side is, how well do you know yourself? Do you know your own strengths? Do you know your own weaknesses? Do you know what motivates you? Do you know what excites you? Do you know what zaps your energy? Do you know what depresses you or stresses you out? That's the internal side. The external side is, do other people know that about you? Do other people know your strengths and weaknesses? If you asked one of your peers, hey, do you know what really motivates me as a leader? Would they be able to answer that question? Or if you ask them, do you know what really zaps my energy, or really just what makes me feel bad and down and depressed at work? Would they be able to answer that? That's the external side of self-awareness. Now, according to Dr. Tasha Eurich's research, 95% of people around the world believe they are self-aware. Only 15% are. The scary statistic is that the more senior you become, the less self-aware you become. And when I say senior, I'm not talking about age. I'm talking about the more senior you become in your company, the less self-aware self-aware you become, the more removed you become from what's happening inside of your company. Empathy and self-awareness. Again, you can practice simple things. Next time somebody comes to you with a problem, don't just respond and say, I'm sorry. Just take a minute. Listen to what they're telling you. And try to think if you have ever been in that kind of a similar situation and how you felt. And try to make yourself feel that same way. Whether you're talking to a customer, whether you're talking to an employee, whether you're talking to a coworker, another leader, it doesn't matter. Self-awareness. Again, ask yourself these very basic questions, and you can even ask your coworkers, your peers, these same questions. I did an executive workshop once for a large consumer packaged goods company, and they had all the leaders in the room. And we did this workshop where all the leaders wrote down what they thought their strengths and weaknesses were, and what they thought motivated them and zapped their energy. And then they paired up with somebody else in the room. And that other person in the room had to answer those same questions about the leader. And then they talked together for 10 minutes. All you could hear was just laughter. People were so far off the mark, it was amazing. They had no idea that other people viewed them these ways. They had no idea that leaders viewed themselves these ways. So you need to make sure that you can create that internal and external self-awareness. David Meek is the CEO of Ipsen, pharmaceutical company, around 6,000 employees. I loved his quote. And he said, I've never had lunch with technology. Have you? I would take an emotionally intelligent person over a piece of software any time. The emotional intelligence piece is essential. Next skill is the skill of the technology teenager. I'm always fascinated when we have issues with technology. Who's the first person that we turn to? We turn to the kids. We turn to the teenagers. I have a 3-year-old, and even my 3-year-old now, she's like, can I watch videos of Naomi? She talks about herself in the third person, which is its own separate issue, but she's probably going to take over the world. I don't know. So you give her an iPhone, and you unlock it for her, and now she can find the little camera app. She can start to scroll through the pictures, and she recognizes the little play symbol, knowing that it's a video, and then she'll watch videos of herself that we've been taking. At 3. Kids are amazing, right? They're digitally fluent, they're tech savvy. For a leader, that means that's exactly who you need to be. It doesn't mean that these kids, the teenagers out there, they can't tell you how to make some of these things. They can't even build some of these things for you. They can't recreate some of them for you, but they are tech savvy, they are digitally fluent, they will figure it out. Every company now is a technology company. You can imagine what your organization is going to look like in 3 years, in 5 years, in 10 years. You think you have a lot of technology now. Just wait. Technology is everywhere. As a leader, you need to understand what these technologies are, what their potential implications might be, how you might be able to leverage them, and what that potential impact might be. It doesn't mean you need to be an expert on blockchain. It doesn't mean you need to know how to code. But you need to understand what the potential of something like blockchain might be. How might you use augmented or virtual reality? What is it? Could it help with patient care? Maybe. You just need to understand it from that high level. Michael Tipsord is the CEO of State Farm, around 90,000 people. And when we were talking, he specifically said that this is crucial because leaders need to be able to separate what's credible from hype. And as a leader, you're not going to be able to unlock any type of transformative possibilities unless you understand technology. The last skill is the skill of the translator. The skill of the translator is about listening and communication. Now, these are two things, granted, that have been around for years. These are timeless leadership traits. So why did the CEOs mention them to me again? Because I specifically asked them, what skills and mindsets will you need to be a leader in 2030? That's the prompt that I gave them when I interviewed them. And they still said listening and communication. Why? Because not only are these the two most timeless aspects of leadership, but these are the two things that are also changing the most. They're changing because we have new technologies and new platforms, globally distributed teams, the things that employees care about with purpose and meaning. All these different things are changing, which means that listening and communication have never been more important. Now, a lot of leaders mistake listening with hearing. Hearing is the unconscious act of letting sound enter your ear. Listening is the purposeful, conscious act of giving somebody your attention and understanding what they're saying. Now, imagine a time, and we've all experienced this, when you were having a conversation with somebody and you could tell that they are hearing you, but they're not listening. You're looking them right in the eyeball, and you can tell that mentally they're thinking about lunch. You don't feel very good, do you? And you can imagine as a leader what would happen if employees try to talk to you and they feel the same. It's no wonder that they say listening is the greatest form of love and respect that you can give somebody. It's about putting away your technology. It's about practicing active listening. It's about paying attention to your body language, letting the other person know that you are hearing them, or that you're listening to them, not that you're just hearing them. It's a big difference. The communication piece is also essential here, because look at all the different ways that we have to communicate. Before, right, 15, 20, 30 years ago, how would you communicate with somebody? I don't know, you maybe go over to their desk, maybe you write them a memo, a note, call someone on the phone. Now we have 100 different forms. We have Slack, we have video conferencing, people are doing town hall meetings, we're using augmented or virtual reality in some cases, you're texting people. I see grown men taking selfies and using emojis with each other. Right, this is a new thing. And we've also all experienced that time where maybe your leader sends you a 300-word text asking you about a project or a client update. And you get that, and you got to scroll through it. It doesn't even fit onto one page, right? Even on those long plus iPhones, you just got to scroll it like, dear, what is going on? We've all gotten those emails from people that look like they should be written to a therapist, right? The way that you communicate as a leader matters. It means understanding the different channels that you're using and who's receiving it. It means understanding if you're going to have a serious conversation with somebody, maybe you reserve that for in-person dialogue, not a sad face emoji. Right? It's understanding the different platforms and channels that are out there and how to use them. Because as a leader, the communication piece is going to be even more essential in the future because there's a lot of noise. So much noise that's out there. How do you make sure that your message gets across? And the more senior you become, often the less time others get with you. Which means that in that short amount of time that other people get with you, your message needs to get across, regardless if you're texting somebody, regardless if you're sending an emoji, if you're on Slack, if you're giving a town hall, if you're doing a video conference, even if you're doing some sort of a hologram, which companies are starting to do, your message needs to get across regardless of the platform or channel that you're using. And they can't all be used the same. Arnold Donald is the CEO of Carnival Cruises. And I love the way that he said this, and he basically understood that it all comes down to understanding what motivates your people, what they care about, what they value, what matters to them. As a leader, the listening and communication piece is going to be essential. So these are the notable 9. The 4 mindsets and the 5 skills that you need to practice. Nobody else has ever seen this before, and it's not even going to be public for probably months. So if you want to take a picture to remember them, go for it. If you can master these things and teach other people to master these things, you will have an enormous amount of success. Next is practice. And when I say practice, you don't have to do crazy things. If you improve 1% a day, by the end of the year, you will be 37% times better. 1% a day. Simple things. When you get back to the office tomorrow, maybe just go up to one of your employees and say, you know what? I just wanted to say thank you for the work that you're doing. I know you're trying really hard. Take 20 minutes. Learn about something new that's going on in your space for the mindset of the explorer. Spend 5 minutes with an employee, just giving them constructive feedback and ideas on how they can improve. Little things. 1% a day. So every day you show up to work, Just ask yourself, what is the one little thing that I can do today to be just a little bit better than I was yesterday? Next is avoid having a typical day. When I interviewed all of these business leaders, I said, what does a typical day look like for you? And they all said the same thing. We don't have a typical day. And I thought this was very intriguing. And it's not on accident. These leaders create atypical days for themselves. It doesn't mean you can't have some sort of a routine, but they try to mix things up as much as they can because it keeps you engaged as a leader. It keeps you seeing fresh ideas and fresh things. It allows you to see different perspectives. It allows you to practice that empathy that we talked about. So avoid having a typical day. It'll help you learn. It'll help you grow. It'll help you see new things. So look at your current day now. Is it the same thing every day? Can you mix up the meetings that you're a part of? Can you maybe explore being with different teams? How can you mix things up a little bit so that you see something different all the time? And the last piece of this is that you have to remember to guide others. A lighthouse is totally useless if there are no ships that the lighthouse is guiding. All of you in this room, you are responsible for not only making yourselves become that lighthouse, but for guiding your people, for guiding your organizations. It's a tremendous responsibility, but it's also a tremendous honor. And the last story that I'll share with you, I know I'm out of time, but one last story I wanted to share with you that I just actually heard from a couple days ago was with Cheryl Palmer, who's the CEO of Taylor Morrison. And she gave me this very moving story about leadership for her. A couple years ago, she was faced with a very tough choice that she had to do. And it was just about writing 2 letters. So she had to write 2 letters to her entire company of 2,500 people. The first letter was, I'll see you in 6 weeks. The second letter was, carry on the legacy that we started. She had a brain tumor, and she wasn't sure if she was going to survive. So the first letter that she wrote was in case she did survive and she was going to be back at work in 6 weeks. The second letter is the one that she wanted her team to receive if things didn't go well. And what she learned from that experience is that it's all about, or being a leader is all about purpose and intention. And she told me that she used to be the type of leader that would just fight fires. She would let her day happen to her. And after going through this experience, she understood the importance of purpose, of connection, of understanding that being a leader is a choice and that it blends into your personal life as well. And that while this is the hardest thing that you as an individual can do, it is also the most rewarding life journey that anyone can undertake. So I hope you can all become lighthouses inside of Vizient. Thank you. Thanks again for tuning in, and I hope you decide to grab a copy of my new book, The Future Leader, at getfutureleaderbook.com. Remember, it's the only book that's out there based on interviews with 140 of the world's top CEOs and a survey of nearly 14,000 employees around the world done in partnership with LinkedIn. Marshall Goldsmith, who many of you know, he's the #1 executive coach in the world for over the past 10 years, and here's what he had to say about my book. He said, "The future leader inspires and teaches people to become better leaders. The skills and mindsets outlined in Jacob's new book are not just essential for work, but also for life. And if every leader read this book, the world would be a better place." That's actually one of my favorite quotes and endorsements that I got for the book. So I hope you decide to grab a copy. Again, you can learn more and get one for yourself and your teams at getfutureleaderbook.com, or you can find it wherever books are sold.